yes, there's always been a great small comms team at the Green Climate Fund doing really high quality work around some of the world's most important and most pressing issues. And climate is quite a tricky space. There are lots of big terms. Of course, we refer often to science, which is why we know that the planet is getting warmer, why we know that we're in trouble unless we mitigate or adapt. So a very science-based focused agenda, but one that interacts at the human level. We're not talking about abstract warming, we're talking about your life, my life. I'm a big believer in story sovereignty. I want to be able to make sure that the hundreds of people who are operating our 253 projects, where we actually see the change happening on the ground, that they are equipped to tell their own stories. So we are at the moment starting to work out how do we make sure that people are trained, that people have the tools necessary, that people know what a good story looks like.
Welcome to the GovComms podcast, bringing you the latest insights and innovations from experts and thought leaders around the globe in government communication. Now, here is your host, David Pembroke.
Hello everyone and welcome once again to GovComms, the podcast about communication in government and the public sector. My name is David Pembroke. Thanks for joining me. Today, a returning guest. Stephanie Speck is the recently appointed head of communications for the Green Climate Fund, which is the world's largest multilateral dedicated climate fund, which is headquartered in South Korea. Now, the fund was established by the 194 countries who are party to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it was established in 2010. Today, it holds $13.5 billion to finance climate change mitigation programs, policies in developing countries. And at the moment, I think there are activities in over 120 countries around the world. Now, Stephanie, for previous listeners, will understand just what an incredible background she has had in government and public sector communication. She has worked in more than 23 countries. Her portfolio of experience includes anti-corruption in Afghanistan, electoral systems in Albania, anti-obesity in Australia, emergency relief in Banda Aceh, governance reform in Iraq, food security in the Pacific, and private sector investment in Palestine. And I could go on. But she has also worked on democratic state building in post-conflict environments, working as a senior advisor to the Senior Minister of Afghanistan, the President of Somalia, and the Prime Minister of Iraq. But she has again taken on another huge challenge, and she joins me from South Korea. Stephanie Speck, welcome back to GovComms.
Thanks, David. It's really lovely to be a return guest.
Now, listen, last time we spoke, you were living the quiet life in suburban Melbourne, working on some important work for the Victorian government, enjoying it, as I remember, assembling teams, building capability, particularly in the digital content space. You are now in South Korea. Tell us the story. How is it that you went from Melbourne, Australia to Seoul in South Korea?
Thanks, David. I started my career a long, long time ago. I won't specifically reference how long ago in the public sector in South Australia, working in health and education, and then with AusAid at a national and international level. So Australia is where I got my grounding. I left Australia in 2006 to try something different overseas. And I guess when COVID hit and so many of us experienced that pang of homesickness if we weren't in Australia, I decided to come back to Australia and see if it was still home. I had a 10-year-old daughter at that stage who'd never lived in Australia, never explored that part of her cultural DNA. So I experimented and I came back to Australia, and I had 2 wonderful years working in Victorian government in education and transport, where I had huge teams, big budgets, and really important, public sector mandates around keeping kids in school, making sure that education was delivered in a quality sense, and then in transport, making sure that people were making wise decisions about their climate impact, that revenues were being made for state government, et cetera, et cetera. But I discovered that Australia was really no longer home. it will always be an important part of my life and my heritage, but it wasn't like I experienced this deep spiritual, oh, I'm home and I can't leave this place. I've had various opportunities in my career where I've tried to step aside from what I would call the development world or the poverty reduction space. And each time I've stepped aside, I've missed it so terribly that I've gone back. And that was really what happened in Australia. I felt very far away from places in the world where I felt like I could make a really big impact and a really big difference. Places in the world where other people might not consider going, where I don't have a problem being and acting. So I literally had a really bad day at work. I Googled international jobs career, and up came the Green Climate Fund. I popped my hat in the ring. And I'd always worked in climate adjacent spaces. So, sustainable development, poverty reduction, and more are becoming more closely interlinked with climate change and climate action. So I knew quite a bit about the space, and I knew that the Green Climate Fund was the world's largest investment fund in this space. And I thought, what better brand to attach myself to try and do something meaningfully at a global scale. So that's how I ended up in Seoul.
Okay, so you went home. I imagine you told your daughter, you said, okay, pack your things. We're on our way again. When you arrived at the Green Climate Fund, what was there, if anything, in terms of an infrastructure to be able to start to tell the story?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to win any mothering awards anytime soon, and particularly according to my my daughter, who when I told her was just, oh my goodness, Mama, that's my 5th school in 7 years, and can you please just make your mind up? And if we move this time, that's it. I'm finishing school in one place. We're not moving. We're not moving again. I think fortunately this role at the Green Climate Fund gives me a really great stable base, and South Korea is a wonderfully weird, exciting place to live, but enough travel and interaction with the cultures and countries that I really value, that I get my fix from not being always in a heavily industrialized space. The Green Climate Fund, the Paris Agreement back in 2015 did 3 seminal things. It set the targets for the world. 196 countries agreed that they wanted to limit the warming of the planet to 2 degrees, and preferably halt it at 1.5 degrees, which means the planet can still sustain human and other forms of life. It decided it would report on progress against those goals. So it's no good having a goal that countries can escape from because there's no reporting mechanism. And thirdly, it made a really big statement about channeling finance to developing countries. And the Green Climate Fund really fulfills that bridging space between the funding of developed countries. So we have big donors, US government has just pledged 3 billion, UK government 2 billion, Germany 2 billion. We have huge donors and we then take that investment and commit it to developing countries. And as you said in your introduction, we have 13.9 billion committed at the moment to around 253 projects in 129 countries. And we've just gone through another fundraising round and secured another 13 billion. Which means we can increase our programming by about 30%. So we're big, and we need to be big because the scale of finance needed to address climate change is in the trillions, not just billions, but in the trillions if we really want to make sure that we can safely keep the planet at 1.5 degrees warmer. So the Green Climate Fund then was in 2015 established as a formal financing mechanism of the Convention of Parties. You hear the word COP28, COP27, that just stands for Convention of Parties, and we are a financing mechanism for that. And that means that we have a global mandate, which I love, and we take that role really, really seriously. So yes, there's always been a great small comms team at the Green Climate Fund doing really high quality work around some of the world's most important and most pressing issues. And climate is quite a tricky space. There are lots of big terms. Of course, we refer often to science, which is why we know that the planet is getting warmer, why we know that we're in trouble unless we mitigate or adapt. So a very science-based focused agenda, but one that interacts at the human level. We're not talking about abstract warming. We are talking about your life, my life, the lives of people in Somalia, where I've just come back from, or the Pacific, where I spend quite a lot of time, impacted on a daily basis. by the irrefutable, inescapable fact that the planet is warming and we're heading into dangerous territory. So I had a really great little comms team when I joined, doing really great quality work, but very output-based, very what I call more down the colouring in side of things rather than the strategic part of comms. So a lot of publications, a lot of outputs, but not really thinking about what I call the 3 R's of comms, which is around reputation building, communicating return on investment, and building relationships. So it was more, we've got a PowerPoint, we've got a poster, we've got a social campaign, we've got a publication, or we've got an event. How do we do those things rather than thinking about how we're collecting information that tells us what people believe, what they need to believe to change their attitudes, and how we're plugging in comms at that end of the spectrum, which is the spectrum, that part of the spectrum that I love most.
So then in terms of working with your team to move from that outputs based, that colouring in department analogy that you use to move towards the 3 R's, that reputation, return on investment and relationships, what did you do to start that journey to become more strategic and more thoughtful about linking communications as that strategic enabler that we know that it can be when used effectively?
I think that one thing, ironically, that we comms professionals are not great at is actually educating others about what comms does and how it works best. In any organisation I've gone into, there's always been a very steep learning curve in the first 2 to 3 months, not so much on my part or my team's part, but on the organisation's part of understanding what it means and what you get when you use comms at an input, not just an output end. So we embarked on quite a process of education. So we did things like we formulated a plan that responded to business goals. We were very clear to say this is not just what comms thinks we need to be doing. This is what you've articulated in a strategic plan. This is what sits in our visioning documents. Here are the goals we have to achieve as a business, to deploy this much money, to build these institutions, to make sure that 50% of our financing is spent on, et cetera, et cetera. How does comms then help us achieve that? So we built a plan around business goals, and then we opened up that planning process. Actually, we held an afternoon where we invited the whole organisation and we said, here's what we think. You've told us this, here's what we think, have we got it right? And that allowed people for the very first time to think, oh my goodness, it's not just about 38 publications plus an annual report. It's about the fact that we've just launched a brand new green fund investment strategy, on the London Stock Exchange. Who's talking about that? Are our partners talking about it? Are we capturing lessons learned? Is there an opportunity, if we capture those lessons learned and disseminate them, that we could replicate that in another stock exchange market? Those kind of things. So we opened up the planning process. We took a really good hard look at about how we were organised, and we regrouped around a few critical areas. There's always a corporate comms function. That's an internal strategic function. That involves supporting executive to do their job. It involves linking what we're doing externally with internal and building capacities of people to be not just the comms team talking about comms, but other people being comms ambassadors. There's always an element of campaigns. So how are we making sure that we're taking the wealth of knowledge that we collect in 253 projects and sharing that? So, and how do we really start talking about the fact that climate action is a positive thing, and there's a great need to be positive when we're tackling climate rather than relying on doomism and fear. The other area we looked at is content and channels. We've talked in the past, David, about the importance of digital, and I have an unwavering support to the importance of digital because its scope and its reach and its relevance blows anything else out of the water. So content and channels is really important, and community. How, in a very congested space, the climate action space is very congested. How do we collaborate rather than compete? So it was about opening up our planning process to scrutiny and getting people involved. So it's not just the people in the organisation that have comms somewhere near their title that do comms, but everyone. About demonstrating the linkage between their business goals and how comms could help them support that. And then about being better structured so that we have clear roles and tasks, and we can start measuring our impact across those 4 fields of corporate, campaign, content and community.
Did you find it was hard?
And of course I went and asked for more budget and more team.
Yeah. So just in terms of building those champions and opening up the planning process, that co-design process to give people a sense of input and engagement and agency over in fact the communication task and function, because as you say, it's communications is there to lead, but communications really belongs to everybody. How hard was it to get people engaged?
I've been at the Green Climate Fund for 7 months, so we've achieved a huge amount in 7 months. Part of that just comes from the fact that I've been doing this for 25 years. So I know pretty well what has to happen, and I can pretty quickly assess an organisation's communication maturity and where we need to come in and make inroads. So I'd say it's early days for us. I still think as a team we need to prove ourselves. We did very little reporting back to the business. So we would have huge events. We go to COP28 and have 500 engagements, or we'd speak to Financial Times, or we'd run a campaign across our socials, and we weren't telling anybody about the impact that had. So when we can come and say, look, we brought 6 journalists to Dubai where COP28 was held, those 6 journalists created more than 600 news articles, which reach more than 300 million people. And if we had to spend money on buying that space, we would have had it, I tripled my budget in the first 7 months, but I would have had to trillionize it, to achieve that scale. So it's really about that process of just joining the dots and continually talking about what value comms is giving the organisation, both in terms of financial benefit because we're doing things differently, or in terms of that exposure and therefore that return on investment benefit.
So you then said, obviously, having brought everybody on the journey and described a path for everybody to see and where they fit inside that path, that you needed additional budget. What did you ask for first?
Well, I've learned the hard way throughout my career that you get in hard and fast on budget. You don't wait. You don't wait 2 or 3 years. You go in and you part of comms is about instilling and building confidence that you know what you're doing and that you're not afraid to report. And I think comms has traditionally always said, we're in such a hard space to report on. We're not really, especially not with digital. We've just liked that mystery, I think. But I've always taken the approach, if you give me more money, I'll show you what we're doing with it, and I'll prove when you invest in us what happens. So I now go in very hard and fast on the budget isn't big enough. It's not big enough for these reasons. Here's what I need to do. Here's what you're going to measure me on. Can I have it? And after spending many years in the Middle Eastern environment, I learned some negotiation tactics, and I'm not going to give them away here because maybe people will listen and it will stop me getting a bigger budget the next time round. But I'm not afraid to use the skills that I have learnt in other environments.
Do you look at, so the gross amount, as you say, is around 13.9 billion. Do you attack it from the point of, if we just spend, a fraction of a percentage point of that amount of money to engage with stakeholders, to build supporters, to raise awareness, that it's money well spent and it's only a fraction of what is available to be spent?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm getting there with this gig, but that's always where I end up going. And particularly in climate action world, it's really important because on the other side, fossil fuel lobbyists and fossil fuel companies and the agencies that support their work spend billions on convincing us that everything's okay, or that they are making changes, or just use a plastic straw and tap yourself on the shoulder and sleep well at night. So we are up against a huge budget on the other side. It's a bit like when I went into Iraq those years ago and we were really trying to effect kicking out Daesh or counterterrorism using digital. And I had a budget that was less than 1% of the size of the budget that was on, that Daesh had. And so I'm constantly talking to people about, this is the size of the issue. That's what they're investing. That's what they have the capability to invest. And we're quibbling over a couple of 100,000. Let's talk about where real risk sits.
Yeah, I think that. Well, I think you've given us a couple of tips anyway. One being the risk conversation, which is always a good one to have with senior leaders because it keeps them up at night, and indeed percentages of these very large numbers, because it really does show you that a rounding error invested in strategic communication and stakeholder engagement can lead to significant return on investment. And I think the point you also raise about not being intimidated about reporting, well, in a digital world, there's no escaping it. So real opportunities there. So at the moment then, you were at the COP, I do follow you on social, so I do see you out and about. What's working at the moment for you in terms of capturing people's attention and capturing their interest?
COP28 was such a buzz. There was so much criticism about it being a circus. 70,000 to 100,000 people. Who really knows who were there? And people complained that we'd lost. It was just too many people and too many conversations. But I found it incredibly energizing. 70,000 people there, apart from the fossil fuel lobbyists. 70,000 people there with the same aim, the same goal. That's an incredible energy. That's like going to a football match and everybody's on the side of the winning team. So I found that that gave me so much hope. And I think for the last 7 months in the climate space, I've really been thinking, which side of that dichotomy do we fall on? Which is going to be most effective for us in the climate action space? Is it hope or is it fear? Fear's often cheaper. Yeah, you can easily stoke fear with just a few well-placed articles or a few lines, in the right person's mouth. Fear is often a cheaper option, and it's sometimes the easier option because you don't need as much evidence or facts. You can appeal to people's emotions. But I truly believe that the fear angle around climate change is exactly where the fossil fuel industry wants us to be, because fear helps us prevaricate. It helps us store. And I was reading somewhere a couple of weeks ago, I can't remember who said it, but they were saying that climate doomism is the new form of climate denial. So it's very, very hard to deny that climate is happening. And for the first time, the Yale climate study reported this year that 72% of Americans now believe in global warming. That's a massive increase in the number of Americans who have felt free to say that. So I think the fossil fuel industry can't get us anymore on the denial stage. So now they're playing on the fact that, can I do anything? Because as I said, fear prevaricates. And fear is the easier option. And I think we firmly need to move into the hope space. And there's incredible reasons to be hopeful around climate action. The cost of renewables is now, the cheapest form of energy in 2020. The price of energy storage dropped by 90% over the last 10 years. Public opinion's on side, like I said, 72% of Americans, which is often that kind of barometer of global feeling about global warming, believe that's happening. Kids are leading the way, and being that form of advocacy is becoming more, I think, more disruptive and therefore potentially more impactful. And climate action is also becoming a legal issue. So you've got this incredible environment where hope can take place. China's producing more electric vehicles than ever before. Governments are investing in renewables. So there's an extraordinary story of change. What I don't think is that the other thing that struck me very much at COP was that there were probably 300 or 400 campaigns running simultaneously, and we were all cannibalizing each other's space. And I think, again, that fragmentation is exactly where the fossil fuel industry wants us to be. Not connected, not coordinating, but competing for space. And what I would love to see, in fact, one of the things that we will be doing with the Green Climate Fund over the space of the next year is pulling global climate change activists and bodies across the UN and with other multilateral partners together, I hope, to actually say, why can't we come together on a narrative and a campaign? And let's put all of the small bucks that we have together and actually be far more effective together than we are separate. So I think there's enormous reason for hope. I think that hope is what changes things because fear stalls, but there is a need for us to be far more cohesive and coordinated across that space together.
That sounds like a challenge and to bring everybody together, but it does make a lot of sense that if you do get an aligned sort of third-party network to be able to carry some sort of consistency around these stories, that you are going to perhaps win the battle for that share of a person's time and attention if they're getting something that is consistent, that is relevant, that is useful, that is helping them to better understand what's taking place, that you do have some chance of getting the message through. But it's such a vast undertaking, and just to pull out some of the things that sort of jumped through my mind as you were speaking, What is the role, as you see it at the moment, of traditional media? And if you know the traditional newspapers, television networks, radio networks, where do you see them as a player and as an influencer in this particular debate?
I think traditional media still has a very strong role because, particularly in the climate space, because it is still more trusted than digital. It is still the realm of expertise rather than opinion. And when you have a science-based argument that you're constantly making, that means that broadcast media and traditional media has a big role in setting that foundational piece around, here's what we know and this is what it means. But expertise only carries you so far. If you want to launch a global movement, you've got to be able to hold on to opinion. And that's where digital needs to dovetail into media. And because digital is where you capture opinion and you move thousands and millions of people to express themselves and have platforms where that's possible. So when I'm thinking about that alliance between media and digital in my comms makeup, I'm thinking digital media is really that, where do I set the foundation? Where do I make sure that expertise is being referred to? And where I'm also defending reputation. And digital is where I go on to shift people into that emotional space, often based around stories of people whose lives are affected, but are also investing in their planet and taking action. We don't want the pity politics. We want to show people as agents of change. So digital is where I move that into that story of change. So both are important, but I am more than ever convinced that digital is where change happens, and I need to be, and my teams need to be across that space. And ironically, the Green Climate Fund, we have like what every organisation has, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc., maybe 4 channels and a website, which is our front door into the business, essentially. But we have 253 projects in 129 countries. We have 150 partners. They all have channels. So why am I so concerned with my channels? I should be making great content that's platform agnostic, that gets shared and picked up on the multitude of partners. And I think sometimes as comms professionals, we're looking too close. Our horizon is here. It's concerned with our own channels, and it's not concerned with making great content that travels into our partners' channels, because that's where I can get on the ground in Kenya or Nairobi or Colombia and change community opinion. That's where I can activate people to go to their governments and say, hey, what does a green energy future look like? And here's what we think you need to do about it.
So in terms then of that creation of that compelling content, which is platform agnostic, how do you do that? How do you create sufficient volumes of content that you can, win the space and win the influence?
That's a critical question. I think the age-old battle in the world of digital is between quality and quantity. You want quality because it keeps people coming back, and you want quantity because you want the conversation to keep going. And I think there are a few simple things that you need to do. You need to have a central digital team who you trust for that quality strategic content. They are the people who are turning the annual report, which no one reads, into a beautiful story piece on digital. They're the ones setting the strategic themes and the narrative that you want to explore. For Green Climate Fund, we have this extraordinary universe of partners and projects happening on the ground, and I'm a big believer in story sovereignty. I want to be able to make sure that the hundreds of people who are operating our 253 projects, where we actually see the change happening on the ground, that they are equipped to tell their own stories. So we are at the moment starting to work out, how do we make sure that people are trained, that people have the tools necessary, that people know what a good story looks like. And so that we can harvest those stories from the ground. And the third critical element, beyond your own team, beyond your partner's team, is I think a content partner, a digital agency that helps keep the churn, and I don't mean churn in any negative sense, that helps keep the churn high. A trusted partner who you can sit with and say, this year or this quarter we're talking about oceans, drought and reforestation. Here are the critical numbers, here are the critical stats, here are where those stories are happening, and we want to see 20 pieces of content over the next month. So trusted digital partners have a really strong role to play in that universe. You can't do it all alone because no one wants to. No one is going to give me the budget to put 20 people in my team. But someone will give me the budget to hire an agency that can then use their 20 people team to create what I need.
Observations around artificial intelligence in terms of helping you to solve that problem around quantity. What are you seeing in terms of either your agencies or your teams or your partners' teams who are able to use artificial intelligence to be able to solve that particular problem that you clearly have in terms of volume and velocity of content?
I think we don't know enough about how AI can be truly useful to us in the comms field. Partly that's due to ignorance, and partly that ignorance is driven by fear of being replaced. I woke up in a cold sweat about 2 months ago and thought, oh my goodness, to stay relevant as a strategic comms professional, I need to get on top of this, and I don't know anything. So part of what my team and I have identified this year is a need for us to collectively learn about AI. And I see AI as having a really, really strong role in that boring and mundane end of the comms business, which is often about locating and synthesizing and then spitting back out, large volumes of information into pithy things. So I think AI gives us a really competitive advantage and a speed advantage as a team to be able to say, okay, if our executive director is going to a conference where she needs to talk about Africa, ChatGPT, go away and scan all of our reports on Africa and tell me the 3 most salient points, those kind of things. Then you need a human eye to run over to make sure that it's accurate. But I think a lot of those time-saving mundane tasks that take up a lot of our day-to-day work in comms can easily be done. What I'm not seeing from my agency side at the moment is them helping us learn more about AI. I think that is a gap. And maybe that's because we're all playing catch up at the moment. So all of us are experimenting, and none of us have really incorporated AI into our business comms models yet. But that will happen over the next 6 to 7 months. And as comms professionals, if we're not on top of that and don't understand how to use it better, we will become irrelevant.
Now, listen, a couple of quick things before you go, a couple of sort of big topics, particularly around climate change, the challenge of misinformation and disinformation. How are you thinking about that? And what are you doing to address those particular challenges?
Climate change, misinformation, disinformation is huge, and it's funded. And we know who it's funded by. So I think about that on 3 scales, a global, a community, and an individual scale. And we have to have strategies to attack misinformation on all of those levels. I see a lot of what I call the dark side, using bots to promulgate misinformation around climate. It doesn't exist, or it's all made up, or you can't do anything. I don't know, and this is, again, one of the conversations I want to have with the broader international communication partners, is why can't we energize bots on the good side? Why can't we put the good bots out there as well? It's a relatively cheap way to do things, and you've got to be able to combat volume with volume. So on that global scale, I'm thinking, why can't we deploy bots to do the good stuff? On the community side, there's, and I'm talking about communities whose climate action we fund. It's really interesting in some of the spaces we work. We work with communities who are living through climate change day by day. I just got back from Somalia. 6 million people displaced, 43,000 excess deaths last year. They contribute 0.03% to greenhouse gas emissions, but they're one of the worst hurt countries in the world, second most vulnerable country to climate change after Chad. People live through climate change, but they don't call it climate change. So there's actually a lot of misinformation that exists around, do people actually understand what's causing this? And if they do understand it, do they then go back to their governments and demand that their governments do something about it? The developed world has an extraordinary opportunity now to leapfrog all the wrong decisions that the developed and industrialized world has made. They can make powerful choices right now for a green energy future, a green path to prosperity. And we have to put the information in them that allows them to hold governments to account and demand a different energy future. And then at the individual level, there are different things here. We should never be dissuaded that my actions count. They do. My individual actions count enormously. And so we need to be looking at our personal lives, and making good and responsible choices. So misinformation needs to be tackled on that global level, at the community level, and the personal level, and we do that through different stories and different advocacy campaigns aimed at different levels.
And a final question around trust and the importance of trust. Really, the Green Climate Fund will not succeed if it's not trusted. How do you see comms playing a role in sitting at the heart and the foundation of that mission to build trust in the work that you do?
We've done a lot of work over the last 7 months. We have a new executive director, Mafalda Duarte, who's also come from a very strong climate investment background. And I have huge admiration for her. She has walked into a situation where our reputation has been, you're the biggest, but you're also the slowest. We are known from our partners to be slow and bureaucratic, and we need to be simpler, faster, and smarter. And so at the moment, we are all about rebuilding trust in our partners who are coming to us for millions and billions of dollars of funding to say, we will look at processes and how we distribute and disperse money. And we've made a pledge, actually, to get to faster, simpler, smarter. So comms is all about looking at that customer service journey or that client satisfaction journey and saying, where are the pain points in our processes? How do we fix those? And then how do we communicate so that people know that we've made that change and start to use the new processes that we have in place. So trust building is an enormous part of my job externally, and also an enormous part of my job internally. And external work is only as strong as we are internally. So building trust and cohesion between fairly siloed areas of operation in the Green Climate Fund is also a critical part of our comms mandate.
Okay, and just a final question then, looking sort of out to the next 3 to 6 months, what are your priorities to make the Green Climate Fund more effective?
We've got to be really present in the US market. You know, that election shapes the world. And we know that climate is an inescapable topic for that election. And we need to make sure that we're putting good, solid information resources into the US that allows the right person who will make the right decisions about climate to win that election. That's a really big strategic goal of ours at the moment. It's also a really big strategic goal of ours to make sure that developing countries are heard on a global scale so that their problems are not dismissed, but their problems are brought to the forefront of international debate around rules and regulations around energy usage and energy storage, energy generation, so that we can help them play on a global policy and political scale. So how do we tell those stories at a global level? And then internally, as I said, we've got a huge internal comms task ahead of us. And sometimes that gets left on the back burner. It's not the sexy side of comms. It's hard grind, internal comms. And it's hard to know when you're getting it right. But we have a big task ahead of us, as I said, in answer to an earlier question around simplicity and access and partnership. So that's a big part of our mandate as well.
Well, Stephanie Speck, a fantastic conversation once again, and thank you so much for your message of hope around climate change, but also just that technical breakdown of the way that you are assembling your team, directing your team, motivating your partners, and thinking about the many challenges that there are in terms of sustaining that. So all the very best with that, and I look forward to future conversations when you can share further lessons with the audience about the challenges that you have, the progress that you're making, and the mistakes that you will no doubt make, as we all do along the way. So Stephanie Speck from the Green Climate Fund, thank you very much for joining us on GovComms today. And to you, the audience, thank you for coming back once again. A rating or review for the program helps us to be found. We've been running since 2015. We've now got 370-something episodes where we have featured people such as Stephanie sharing their wisdom with you. And I'm sure today I have notes and notes and notes of stuff on that I've been scribbling down. One in particular, the 3 R's: reputation, return on investment, and relationships. I think that's a great little rubric to sort of keep on your desk to think about, the purpose of the work that you do, the mission of that strategic enabling function that comms can bring to so many functions. And indeed, recently to see the OECD now paying so much attention to strategic communication, and the first scan that they've done now into the function of communication inside UK government is so uplifting, because it is starting to show and to recognise the work that you do as communicators in government in the public sector is being recognised and is being acted upon. So keep at it, all of you who are out there telling stories. But very grateful for your time. We'll be back at the same time in 2 weeks. My name is David Pembroke, and it's bye for now.
You've been listening to the GovComms podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes.